Hello and welcome to the TrueWorks podcast, where we help you understand how the gospel transforms your life and your work. I am your host, Joshua Smith, and with me yet again is my co-host, Doug Meikle. Doug, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. And again, I've made it to co-host, so wow, my life's getting better and better.
This is the ceiling, not going above.
Oh, believe me, I know that.
So today we are talking about common grace. Common grace. It's very important to not only the Faith Work Intensive that most of these podcasts in our first season have been following, but really created the TrueWorks organization, or is a guiding principle for us, animating principle for us at the TrueWorks and all of our various endeavors. So we need to get a handle on what is common about common grace and what is gracious about common grace and how it affects the way we act, live, and love.
Yeah, so we're going to ask you to read a piece by Wayne Grudem on common grace, and you guys have already read in the course of your work the Mau's Ships of Tarshish.
Tarshish.
Yes, something like that. Anyway, Ships of Tarshish, and but mostly this time we want you to read the piece by Wayne Grudem, and Wayne makes the point as he goes through that as we should, that the story that Christianity begins with, the story of the garden, kind of ends with this devastating loss, where humankind is placed outside of the garden, outside of the place where they were supposed to be, because they have violated God's law and decided to take the matter of their future into their own hands. Now, obviously, that's a metaphor there. I mean, it's greater and deeper than a metaphor, but it is at one level a metaphor too, that we are now outside of that intimate relationship with God, and that now has consequences, and the consequences of that will be our death. We were not designed to die. We were designed originally to live with God forever, but the consequences of our own actions are such that we have taken it upon ourselves to define our own lives, and one of the consequences of that is our ultimate demise and our ultimate death. So the sort of premise from which that starts is that, hey, according to the story of the Bible, we're all supposed to die, but we look around and we don't immediately die. And we're all supposed to be kind of isolated and alienated from God, and certainly many of us are, but others are not. So what is that? What's the explanation for all of that? For the good things that are clearly in the world, what is the explanation for us having those? And
since
why?
We're outside the garden.
Since we're outside the garden, right? Yes. We are no longer in the place that God has created for us, and yet there is indeed great joy to be had here. There are good things to enjoy. Why does that happen? Why does that happen? And the answer that Christians have given over time is this thing called common grace. Common grace. Did I get that right?
No, I thought that was great.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, appreciate that.
You're welcome. So this kind of setting up the context of all things with innocence, with God, thrown outside the garden. Now there are consequences for that. And we have death, the consequence. And death, not just in the physical sense, but in the death as an alienation, separation, not only individually, but from man to man, or human to human, human to God, of course, and us to creation. Things are not what they should be. Work is toilsome and drudgerous and difficult, and we can experience great harm. The world is not safe. We have to take precautions and measures, and relationships are broken and are hard, and sometimes they unfortunately demise. We have to part our separate ways, so on and so forth. So death takes many facets, like a black diamond.
Yes, yeah. I think it's interesting, though, that for me, at least, the easiest thing to explain, and maybe this is why common grace is so powerful a concept, is the easiest thing to explain is why things are so bad, because that's our common experience. The harder thing to explain is why things can be good, of how we can experience joy, we can experience art, great art, we can be moved to compassion, those things can happen, and it's that common good, or the fact that even exists, that I think is so unusual that and we often will just take it for granted, right? Most of the folks listening to this podcast may not have had that thought before, but I think the fallenness is the easier thing to explain. It's less easy to explain the fact that we have things like art and music and architecture and engineering and great roads that we can drive on and great vistas that we can enjoy and perceive. And these are the things that are not so easy to explain if you take a moment's thought.
Yeah, I want to juxtapose just this push on a little, because I wonder how many in our modern context, what their kind of posture to the world would be, because evidently from what you have said, it's kind of easier to explain the fallenness, more difficult to explain the goodness. I think that some of our listeners would kind of see it the reverse,
maybe
that our world kind of presupposes that things are good. Maybe they don't look at the evidence close enough.
Well,
Granted.
Hold on, though.
Okay.
I mean, I think that, so here's a good example. I mean, all across the Western world, the birth rate is falling below replacement rate.
Yes.
What does that speak to? It speaks to often that folks see a world that's so not good that they do not wish to share it with children.
Yeah.
And I think so life, as I always say, is a game of averages. It's like baseball. So sure, of course, there are folks out there who have wonderful existence and can't think of anything but the goodness of all the great things around them. But if you look at the average, what certainly in the Western world, if that's the right way to put it these days, in the places that we live, folks are becoming so disillusioned. They can easily explain the fallenness of the world. Think of things like global warming. Forget about whether it actually, let's assume that it exists. Don't write in, don't spam me or something because I'm a denier or something. But my point is really that stuff is, it creates an atmosphere of pessimism for sure. And critique. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. From that, yes, I think that's true.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get into anthropogenic global warming or whatever, but there is a sense there that it creates a deep pessimism about the world and our place within it, that the consequence of which people can explain why the world's going to hell in a handbasket pretty easily.
Yeah.
What's
or they
harder,
think this is hell.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
what's much harder to explain to the modern human being, I think, often is the concept of why beauty is a real thing. Yeah, why beauty, for example, is a real thing, or why there could be or can be peace, why there can be flourishing, and that's not some kind of nirvana that only is available to Christians, let's say, in our context, but in actual fact is something that God sends out into the world the possibility of, that's available to some extent to all. That's the commonness of common grace, that God sends out into the world both the circumstances and the skills to allow us to enjoy this place in the time that we are given here.
So let's dig a bit further, a bit deeper into why these instances of beauty, of goodness, we could add of truth, of unity, of peace, why we are giving the catch-all description of those things, common grace.
Yeah.
I think it's easier to start in order. Common. Why is it common? I think, Doug, you explained that very well.
Because it's available to all.
Yeah, because it's not available only to those, say, who are in the church, right? So it's not special. That's the antithetical idea to common. So special grace is given to those who are regenerate, those who believe, and there are special benefits by Jesus' death on the cross that are given to those who are regenerate. Common grace doesn't have that requirement.
Yeah.
It's given out irrespective of people's belief or regeneration. It's given to the just and the unjust.
Well, that's how the Bible puts it, right?
Yes.
The rain falls and the sun shines on the just and the unjust.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the preacher says that, right, in Ecclesiastes. And one way of interpreting that the man in Ecclesiastes interprets it, is, so what I do just doesn't mean anything to begin with, right? So let's just eat, drink, and be merry, because there's nothing better for man to do on his limited days on earth, right? But that, if we took that posture, we would not have that second item in the title, the grace part, right?
Okay.
So grace, let's talk about, so common is a bit easier to understand. Let's talk about in what way is it gracious?
Well, first, because I think you're going to get specific there, but I think there's an important...
Help me, Doug.
Well, don't worry, I'm going to hand it back to you in a moment, but I think one of the things about grace is that it is available to all, but it's also based on this general principle that God not only creates but sustains the world. His very sustaining of the world is a gracious act towards his creation. Now, there are particular things that I think you're going to illustrate them in a more particular way of thinking about that in several different contexts. But I think the starting point needs to be is that God... It may look around you. We're in the city of Houston. It may look around you that the mayor of Houston, if you like, sustains Houston and fills its potholes, etc. But at the existential level, the Christian believes that God sustains all things in the world, and that is an act of grace.
Yeah.
But you're probably going to get a bit more specific than that.
I will, but now you've thrown
prompted
in this,
something.
Yeah,
okay, wow.
That is so good. So this is in opposition. This is in contrast to that the world sustains itself, right? So the Christian view of the world is that the only thing eternal is God, and that by the word of his power things came into being. But like Doug just said, not only came into being, continues in being.
Yeah.
Theologians have a term for this.
Oh, okay.
They call it conservation.
Yeah.
So creation happened in sometime in the historical past, but conservation happens now. That if God took his hand away from the nature of things, that things would cease to be.
Yeah.
They have no independent, ultimate reality in themselves.
Yeah. So God is not like the watchmaker, if you like, who could, because God could be creator in the sense that he creates this self-sustaining thing, almost winds it up like a clock, sets it down and said, okay, I'll be back in billions of years' time or something like that. That's not the way that Christians feel God is with the world, that he is intimately, Christians believe, and this is how the idea of God that becomes very clear in the Bible, is that God is intimately involved with his creation, that he is constantly available to it, and he's constantly working with it, shaping it to its ultimate goal and purpose.
And constantly available to it, not primarily in these marvel and miraculous events. That's like the minority instance. But in all, see, I'm going to mess up the Colossians 2 passage, but that Christ could be in all and for all, or
Christ is all and in all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Christ is all and in all. That God is closer to us than we are to ourselves.
Yeah.
That he's closer to things that things are to themselves.
Well, we in a recent episode we talked about Jonathan Edwards, and we did illustrate there that that Jonathan Edwards was an amateur naturalist, and that was one of the things that was constantly in front of his mind as well, is that he would see the wonder in the created order, see the wonder in the formation of a flower or a plant. It would just yes, and that's one of the things that living in a culture that doesn't believe in creation takes away the wonder of creation, that we are mere accidents of the process of evolution rather than the product of the creation of a loving God. Changes our orientation towards the world. Yeah.
One primary way of that is that whatever flower or a figment of light or stars that we see that may entice us because of its beauty, it may lead to nowhere, right? So in a picture where we're not given creation, but there are just a bunch of atoms bouncing around, we could inquire into the flower, into the nature of things, and come up with dead ends, because there's no optimism that it all is knit together in some beautiful pattern. Where the Christian can absolutely affirm those wonder moments as you're onto something, because you're detecting because you're created in the Creator's image, you can now detect the patterns in the natural world. We could talk a whole episode on that.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, and this particular piece we're asking you to read is not really very long, but it does give you the sense that God is all and in all, and that basic relation, and that He has gone forth in the world with this common grace that has the benefit of all, and we as Christians and non-Christians get the benefit of the art and the agriculture and the building and the architecture and all the various different things that come out of the flourishing of that. We collectively get the benefit of it. And I think, so that relates back to your work too, is that common grace extends to, for example, your entrepreneurship, that you can create something that causes the world to flourish. That's part of the common grace that God grants to you. Or if you're a skilled doctor, part of the common grace that God gives to the world is your ability to serve both those who are Christians and those who are not. God does not give the church skills and say, serve only your own. He gives the world skills and tells us to serve each other. And the church is a part of that kind of grand command to all. Now, some obviously take that more seriously than others, but I think the point of this is that is God's posture and relationship towards the world. God loved the world. God loved the world. That's, the beginning of John 3:16, of course. And God so loved the world. And that the common grace part is how He loves. Yeah.
And also, when we're in our professions and we come into contact with those who are maybe clearly not Christian, there could be a question that arises of, gosh, that seems so good, whatever the product is or whatever the activity is, but they are separated. That they have we mentioned in previous episodes, Terrence Malick has such beautiful pieces, and yet he doesn't seem like he's a professing Christian. Is there some other source or element or principle by which people can get beauty, truth, and goodness? And Common Grace says, no. It's all from the same source, but it can be distributed to those who are not professing Christians. And so this is, and this tradition emphasizes, this is the maximal sovereignty view of God that we can have, because nothing that is beautiful, good, or true, or unified, or peaceful in the world is something that, God didn't think of. That's not somehow animated by God's power and His character.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Well, that's the tradition. When we do this faith and work intensive, the tradition of which you are a part, when you read through these, is that kind of profoundly Augustinian tradition where God is completely sovereign, and not in the sense of this inanimate thing that moves the chess pieces around the cosmos, but completely sovereign in the sense he has this profound and deep relationship with his creation that he will not let go, And I think he will bring it to its fullest extent over a period of time. And we should probably, though, at the same time, say something about special grace as well.
Yes, because
I mean, it's in the reading that you're going to get, so you should look at it there. But also by way of contrast, because as we talk about this common grace, we also don't want to confuse the creation with God. They are not the same thing, and also that take away the kind of moral necessity for us to do our part in orientating ourselves back towards God by converting ourselves. Yeah. Mm-hmm. If that's not even the right way to think about it, but you know what I mean there.
By being converted
by
God's grace. Yeah. Right. Yes. Because it's not, so common grace is in contrast to special grace, because special grace does convert.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the act of God where he regenerates the dead sinner into newness of life.
Yeah.
And when you are a recipient of special grace, that means you are coming into a reconciled relationship with God that affects your eternity. Common grace does not do that.
No.
Some misinterpretations, and I want to emphasize misinterpretations of common grace, is some type of universalism. That since God, for example, I was having a conversation years ago with a friend, and we were talking about I brought up Christ, and he was some sort of nominal Catholic Christian, and he said, "Well, aren't all people God's children?" And what he meant by that phrase is because all people kind of receive some benefits of the goodness of God because he's interacting with the world, isn't everybody basically saved? Well, what has happened there is there's a confusion of common and special grace, because everybody is a recipient in some form or fashion of common grace because they experience the beauties, the good some goods in the world, but not everybody is a recipient of special grace because special grace is the only thing that saves, and not everybody is saved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that is certainly true. And, but I remember, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that I like about, getting back to my favorite, St. Augustine as well, but his writing in the City of God, there are clearly, obviously, two cities. There's the city of man and the city of God. And those have two different destinations, clearly, for St. Augustine. And yet, he does try and maintain that, for a lot of the time, we can worry about what the boundaries of those two cities are too much. Yeah, I think and I think sometimes as Christians we kind of do that. We focus more on the boundaries and who's inside and who's not than the mission that God gives us to help redeem the earth.
What sort? This may be too tangential, but
possibly.
What sort of boundaries focusing too much? Because for Augustine, the boundary is ultimately in the inscrutable will of God. We can't come to
ultimately
certainty.
know.
Ultimately know, and so that affects his view of the church.
Yeah, sure. And I think, and I guess maybe that's what I'm thinking as well, is that this is not completely true, and there's obviously things that I think we are called to do and behave behave as a response to the gospel in a way that honors God. Mm-hmm. And yet, at the same time, I think if we focus only on those behaviors and those commands, we might be losing the sense of a church that is created by God's sovereign act in this world. I think also of the creative impulse
converting
that people
yourself.
Yes.
Yeah,
indeed.
to kind of
use my phrase.
Yeah.
My erroneous phrase. But yeah, I mean, I think that maybe I'm not making myself very clear, and maybe that's because I'm not being very clear, and I don't have it clearly articulated in my own head. But I think, I think the posture towards the world, I think, is very important for us in this time and day. And I think as folks who are going to be out there in the working environment, in the workplace, and if you're like my entire career was in big public companies, and that's not an easy place for you to practice your Christian faith, because in essence, that big public company is built around the separation of the sacred and the secular, and you're definitely in the secular when you're in that world. Now, for the Christian who says, wait a minute, the whole world is sacred, that's actually a kind of a tension-filled place in which to live. You're in an organization that's kind of split down the middle, that is almost forcing you to make a choice of saying, no, you're in the secular world now. Whereas from where I sit, that doesn't really exist. There is only the sacred in our earth. That's not an easy place to live. But common grace, I think, maybe helps you out a little bit there. You think, okay, I can work within within my vocation, in the task that I've been given, in the firm that I work, and that can be part of kind of God's common grace and common interaction with the world, and maybe that's something that makes work more meaningful. I don't know.
Along those same lines, that we can come along in our work, come along the non-believer, and celebrate the good production products, processes, and all the rest. We can celebrate them, although we take a different understanding of where the source of that is.
Sure.
So when they have a good idea, or a good deliver something, a good product, what we're not recommending is that we say, oh, well, since it's not by Christians, then we just throw it out. No, not at all. No. God, because out of His common grace.
I do think that most folks would say, hey, if it's a good product, it's a good product, but they wouldn't know why necessarily it's a good product. The whyness of that is common grace. It's the fact that God does not only give creativity to His Christian people, He gives it to the world. The world has creativity. The world has ingenuity. The world has focus. All these things that we take into work that are good properties to have as individuals in work, God grants those to many people, to the world, if you like, for our own flourishing, for our cities flourishing, for our nations flourishing, for the world's flourishing. And again, that should be a cause of great satisfaction and joy for all of us. That in actual fact, even though God may be saving to Himself a relatively small remnant of this earth, He has given us this context in which we may share good things. We may share good things with our neighbor, and I think and celebrate good things with our neighbor as well. There's nothing, it's interesting that the context of how we explain common grace is oftentimes as well the context of depravity, of total depravity, as it says in our tradition. And what I've come to understand that means is that the sinfulness, our isolation from God, touches every part of what we do. I have no act in my life, good or not, that is not touched by the fact that I'm a fallen creature. In that sense, my life is totally depraved. There's no point at which that depravity does not touch. Yet at the same time, the flip side of that almost is this universal concept of common grace, and that despite my total depravity, God releases into the world for the benefit of all His grace, which is kind of this joyous concept to me, that I was not left with just my brokenness, and the world is not left with only its brokenness, but is in fact animated by this great grace that God has poured out into the world. As I say, I think that's kind of awesome, honestly.
Yeah, it's bountifully this view of overflowing fountain, right?
It's not scarce.
Yeah, as sometimes particular grace, which is a misunderstanding of particular grace, because that is also an overflowing. But sometimes, at least a caricature of this tradition would be, he just has a little bucket of grace and he's just distributing it to the small remnant, as you said, and then that's it.
Yeah.
And that's incorrect to understand particular grace, but also you have common grace, which is this bounty overflowing.
So one last word about this in terms of your work as well. I just want you folks to think about this in terms of when you take this stuff into work, that means that every task you do in work can be part of kind of God's common grace and common purpose for the world. There's no task, even your most mundane task. You're preparing your budget, or you're
ordering paper clips.
Ordering paper clips, if that's what you do, I guess. All of that can be towards the glory of God. And that's not some kind of esoteric thing. It's something that we experience the benefit of that every single moment of every single day. Because to take a thought all the way back to where we started, when we were outside of the garden and we looked back at that gate and those gates were guarded, we were outside of the territory that God had created specifically for us for our flourishing. That was our choice. That was our choice. And we made that choice, and now we're dealing with the consequences. Those consequences are mitigated every second and every moment of every day by God's sustaining grace and common grace poured out into the world. That should be our starting point for all things. And that's the joy that is potentially at the heart of the Christian life. Knowing ultimately that particular grace brings us on home into eternity. And that's, again, as a posture, that I think is enlivening and helps us take this thing we call faith into the world.
I think that's a fitting place to end
Thank you.
Our talk about common grace. Thank you for joining the TrueWorks podcast as we talked about common grace. We hope that you found it helpful for your life and work. You can find more episodes of the TrueWork podcast on all podcasting platforms, or you can visit us at our website at www.trueworkshouston.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you.